Ken Rockburn is a well-known Canadian broadcaster, interviewer. Many listeners are familiar with him from his days at Shea 106 and more recently the CBC, and then in Living Colour on CPAC.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. In Living Colour.
Yes. I like what you say at the very end of the book. TV can never equal a sense of intimacy, the feeling of eavesdropping or the spontaneity and natural flow of an interview on radio. The name of the book is Medium Rare, after the radio program that you hosted.
Yeah. They put a subtitle on it called Jamming with Culture. I don't know why they did that. I just hate it.
Your book actually came out 10 years ago. The first thing that came to mind when I read your book was, boy, you must have a great book collection with all sorts of signed editions.
Oh, I do. I have. In fact, it's funny you should say that. I was just showing my 22-year-old daughter the other day. She was talking about Brokeback Mountain, the film, and I said, "Oh, come here, I want to show you something." And I pulled out Annie Proulx's Close Range, of which is the last story. It's only about 20 pages long, and showed it to her, and she said, "That's cool." And I said, "Yeah." And then I showed her the inscription, which is "Many fun hours talking with Ken. Come to Wyoming and visit."
Brilliant.
And then letters, because we corresponded for a while. So, and I'd forgotten and stuffed into this book were these letters from Annie Proulx. So I impressed the hell out of my daughter, I got to tell you, with that one. But yeah, I got a lot of stuff, and I'm running out of places to put it. Frankly, I collect local art, but I've run out of place to put art, and I've run out of place to put books. In fact. When I mentioned to you earlier that I'm going to be going to my cottage, one of the things I'm lugging to my cottage is a box of the book overflow that's not going to have to go there because I've run out of shelf space. So, yeah, I got a lot of stuff.
Medium Rare, the book. Richard Fitzpatrick, the bookseller, put it into my hand about 2 weeks ago.
Surprised anyone still has it.
Well, he's got it. He had it.
Good.
He's moving over to Hintonburg.
Oh, okay.
Spadina. And speaking of moving boxes... he's a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
Delightful guy. It was interesting to juxtapose your book, which is it's more anecdotal than the book. I'm going to be interviewing Eleanor Wachtel.
Ah, yes.
And her book, it's a bit like reading The Economist because she's primarily transcribed
the interviews.
Whereas your book is
more
much
narrative,
more,
which was the original idea. I was asked by John Metcalf of Porcupine School to write this book. It was his idea originally. And he knew I had all these interviews. He knew that I had interviewed Margaret Atwood. So the idea was that he wanted me to write these pieces in which I think what he really wanted me to do was he wanted me to write a critique of these people, because a lot of them he doesn't get along with. Robertson Davies he doesn't get along with. In fact, his disembodied voice appears in the interview that I did with Robertson Davies at one point.
Well, I don't know if he doesn't get along with him. Criticism was his opinion.
Yes, he called Robertson Davies stultifyingly boring. But...
And you know what? I think I agree with John Metcalf.
Well, I do most of the time on that issue, actually. But I think what he wanted something that was really going to kind of stick it to these people. And I said to him at the time that I knew what my limitations were. I'm good at what I do because I'm informal and casual and relaxed, and I'm interested in people when I interview them. And that's it. You're not going to get some in-depth treatise from me on each one of these people that I've interviewed. It's just not within my capacities.
I love the way you dismiss Douglas Copeland and...
that was easy.
The chapter I went to was The Ego Has Landed, and I liked the way you sort of tiptoe around Peter Zowski.
Yeah.
You both won this award, and he wouldn't even talk about it, and then... He said, I won 5, and then he stopped. Then he made it into a joke.
Yeah.
But you took it. I think you were a little bit
there was an edge to it when he first said it, and which kind of startled me, because at that point, I knew from people that I talked to, and from the times that I'd met him before, that he admitted it too, even in this interview. He was a different person off the air than he was on the air, and he could be unpleasant. Now, towards the end, when he was really ill and everything, he was just a sweetheart of a guy. But yeah, he could be a real pain in the ass, and I was trying to sort of get to that in the interview. And
it was very soft, and I think maybe that's getting back to what John Metcalf... Yeah. Do you think that's what he wanted?
I don't know what it was. I know Metcalf has never gotten along with Margaret Atwood ever. I mean, well, I shouldn't say ever, but ever since the Oxford Book of Canadian Verse, which she edited, which came out in 1971 or something like that, I can't remember, and she didn't put him in it. And that, I gather, is what began their thing. She always thought it was funny whenever I mentioned it to her, so... Yeah. But I did write in the book that I always felt guilty that I really like her, but I don't like her books. But I will say this, whenever I interviewed her, I made sure that despite the fact that I'm not really a fan of her books, I made sure that I read them right to the last page.
Well, you don't want to look like an idiot,
No.
which is what she specializes in.
And,
right?
and I'll tell you, the one time that I realized what a smart move it is to, I mean, in the exigencies of day-to-day radio, you can't read everything all the time, but you can read as much as you can. And I never wanted to insult any author.
Well, here, let me read to the audience what you say. Page 3 of your centrifugal.
Yes.
Centrifugal?
Centrifugal.
Bumble Puppy. That's the introduction, and it's out of Brave New World.
Brave New World, that's right.
This will not be my style, I swore. I will read everything I pledged, and to a large extent, I keep those promises.
Yeah, to a large extent. So you can't always. And the one time that it was brought home to me was Richler's Barney's version, where I got it from the publisher. He was coming in a week and a half, I think. And I'm doing a 2-hour radio show every day, and I have lots of other stuff I have to read, but I'm pouring through this book, and I really liked it. And the day that he was coming in, I think I still had about 20 or 25 pages left to read. And I kept getting distracted at work by other things that I had to do, and I thought, damn, I'm not going to fit in that. Wow, it's only 20 or 25 pages. You know, it's not going to be a problem. And then I found myself about an hour before we were going to go into the studio when he was going to arrive with some time on my hands. I said, oh, good. So I went off somewhere quiet. And I read it, and of course, anybody who's read that book knows that the last sentence of the book changes all kinds of things in the story. And I just remember reading that and going, oh boy, I am so glad I decided to read this, because I would have looked like such a moron, you know, where you'd read everything but 20 pages, and he's going to look at you like you hadn't even cracked the spine, you know. That was the one time I realized it was a good habit to get into.
Well, I like your story in the book about the Graham Greene book versus the Green, you thought he was some environmentalist or something.
He was a sweetheart of a guy. We got away with that one, boy. I managed to glean a couple of facts from different spots in the book in about 5 minutes, and using those at the appropriate times in the interview made it appear to him. And you don't want to say to the person, look, I'm really sorry. You probably should, but I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to read it. You sound like such an ass.
Yeah, because you go on to say in the book, you know, they spent years and years on this thing, and here you are. What you do and what we're doing here is what most people do in their leisure time. Is, you know, they'll go to a nice dinner party, and what do you search for? Well, you search for interesting conversation with interesting people, and that's what enriches their lives. I want to devote some time to the text. You do put your opinions in here.
That was a hard thing to do, too, I have to tell you. Being trained as a journalist, you're trained to take all of that stuff out, right? So when the editors kept saying, no, put that stuff in, it was like, you know, reluctantly and difficult to do, because you're thinking to yourself, well, why would anyone give a crap what I think?
That actually brings up another point about the interview itself. I'm talking a fair amount of the time here, and the people that I admire who are interviewers do that too. They have personalities. The listener gets to know that person and rely on them. I think, whereas Eleanor Wachtel perhaps is a bit less that way.
I think she's less that way.
She researches impeccably, but she's much less that way.
Yeah.
Where do you fit in?
Well, I struggle not to have too much of myself in an interview, and it's difficult sometimes. I know my subject, so I'm comfortable with it. I'm comfortable with whatever direction it's going to take me, so I don't have a roadmap planned out for an interview at all. There might be one or two things that I'm curious about that I want to know that I'll get to at some point during the interview, but I think I probably let more of myself into interviews than a lot of other people do, and I say that only because of the reaction that I get from listeners and viewers. Most often, because this is just the nature of audiences, the people who like what you do are rarely the ones who let you know that, unless they happen to stumble across you somewhere in person, then they'll let you know.
And you refer to that in your book.
Yeah. The people who don't like you, they're the ones who will write, or these days they're the ones who will email. And you get that instantly, and I get it all the time, because people think that because you've asked a certain question, now I'm talking now mostly about political stuff on CPAC, but it applies to just about anything, because you've asked a certain question, that to them indicates that you are of that mind, when in fact that's usually not the case at all.
No, you're
usually asking a question to elicit a certain response, to take a conversation in a certain direction.
Yeah. Or you're being devil's advocate, or whatever.
Or whatever. But the responses that I've gotten from people, vicious. It's breathtaking. Some of the things that
even in Canada
will say to you. And of course, my problem is that even though I've been doing this for a long time, more than 30 years, 35 years now almost, I've never developed that thick skin that you need. I still get pissed off at these things, and I still respond to them. You know, at the CBC, they wouldn't let me answer the phone. I've said that before after my show finished at 6 o'clock, you know. And then I would yell back at them. I really yell back at them. And so they told me I couldn't answer the phone anymore. And then, because you're not supposed to do it at the CBC, because every listener is precious.
Whoever said it, I can't recall, but if there isn't some sort of debate or a difference of opinion, then there's no conversation.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's what you want. You're after that, as you say. We still haven't gotten to the text.
No, okay, sorry. Okay, all right. Ask me something about the actual book. Let's see if we move one or two more units.
Yeah, how many have you got anyway left?
I don't know. They shredded them. I got the ransom note from my publishers, as all writers do. You know, because you want it. I have a box of them somewhere.
Right. Okay.
And that's pretty much it.
So, getting to the text, this is a sort of anecdotal book of literary criticism. That's one way I might label it. The first chapter, it's about the Beat generation, and you going up to Quebec City, I believe, and then some sort of conference.
1988,
the fact that Truman Capote dismissed Kerouac's work as typing and not writing, which is something that's just bang on, I thought. I never could get his stuff. And I don't think I personally think it's a classic because it's deeply attached to that era. And you read it now.
It doesn't work.
I never thought it was worth much anything anyway. And I like the way that the woman that was married to Kerouac and slept with
Carolyn Cassidy.
Yeah, dismissed them both as a couple of guys that were empty. And
I got a guy really angry with me because of that chapter, actually. And a couple of years later, Carolyn Cassidy came through Ottawa. She'd just written her memoir, Off the Road, it was called. She was staying at his house. He invited me over, and I went over, and we did another interview, and she signed a book for me and stuff. But what I wrote about her in that chapter, and I feel a little guilty about it now, too, but I think I said something about my sense of her was as a slightly kind of dotty housewife.
Yep.
Who, you know, really was, it didn't seem like she was ever comfortable with all that. I mean, she got religion at one point or later in her life and so on. Anyway, I didn't mean it to sound as dismissive as it was, and this guy who had been instrumental in getting me together with her took a great exception to my characterization of her and sent me a very tart letter, and I haven't seen him since.
It's funny because I would tend to agree with him. I thought you were quite dismissive of her, and when I read what she had to say with them, I thought that's right. What she's saying is right on.
Yeah, and that may have been, I can't recall now, but my sense is that may have been the pressures of, well, at that point it would have been Metcalf, who I was still with, to put some teeth in things, to put some edge in things, and so that may have been it, but I'm not using that as an excuse. I felt badly about it afterwards, and I still do, but what the hell are you going to do?
No. It's how you felt at the time, I would think. I mean, you're not going to write anything you didn't believe in, right? I thought the strongest chapter in the book was the chapter on Irving Layton when you got together for dinner.
I would agree with you.
I loved what he suggests that everyone go around the table and talk about the most powerful coincidences, and Pierre Lachaise, the graveyard in Baudelaire.
Yeah, and he realized he was.
Well, he was so sad, and he was looking for the grave, and he suddenly started crying, and the closer he got, the more I thought that was just, well, it was exactly what he was saying. He said, I'm very mysterious. And yours, maybe you could quickly tell us that.
Yeah, well, actually, that was one of the, I remember being struck by that, because I talked about how my wife and I had gone to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, and they had gone to all the regular places, you know, went to Jim Morrison's grave, did all that stuff, went to Oscar Wilde's grave, and all of those things, and then we came across Modigliani's grave, and there was a little note on top of the tombstone, held down with a stone, I think, and all it said was, Amadeo, forever the king. And then I was back in Canada, later it was, not that much later, and I was interviewing, was it Anne Michaels? Anne
Michaels, yep.
Yes. Yep. It wasn't Fugitive Pieces that had come out at the time, because it was a book of her poetry I think I was interviewing her about. And in her book of poetry there was a book about Modigliani's wife, I think it was.
Well, the title of the poem was Stone.
Yeah. Anyway, it was just, it was all very... It was all, I said, but you know,
there was
some reference to the little king. Yeah, that's right. Reference to the king.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was all very peculiar because she'd never been there. She'd just written this poem, and it was only a few months after I had been there and seen this thing that said Amadeo forever the king, and it was so odd. And I happen to remember it when Leighton was talking about about being at Père Lachaise, about Baudelaire's grave, and so on. Yeah, that was quite a night. That night with Leighton, that was a spectacular night. I had recorded. I think the reason that everything there was I could do it in such detail was because I had like 6 hours of recorded material. We had a microphone hanging over the middle of the table, and everything that went on that whole event was. It was a massive undertaking. I did a 30-minute documentary that I aired on Medium Rare, which that was based on.
I'm just looking for. I just want to read this just a little bit out here because he said it beautifully about poetry. Or maybe I could get you to read it. It's
sure.
It's one paragraph, and it starts with "I think."
Okay. This is Irving Leighton when he just turned 80. And he said at this dinner, "I'd like to think there's a buried self in all of us, a child, an adolescent, somebody who's tasted a beauty or insight which ordinary life prohibits. And that child is there, and I think Blake is with me, and Shelley is with me, and Wordsworth is with me in expressing just that thought. In ourselves there is somebody who is very beautiful and very innocent, who has escaped the corrupting influence of civilization. And that individual is struggling to keep alive, to say, you know, the world really is beautiful. There is the color red, and there is the touch of the hand, and the kiss of the mouth, and there are beautiful eyes, and you look into those eyes, and you have been profoundly moved, and you have seen sad things and heard sad songs, and they've touched you as nothing else has. Remember that. Remember that as you go down the street, in the alley. That sound is there. It's always there. That's the poet. He has some kind of touch, some association with that ghost, and that's what makes him a poet. He's haunted. He's troubled all of his life, and all his life he seeks to release his troubles. Imprisoned child, ghost spirit that is buried within every individual." Now, he said that off the top of his head. He just stood up, and this is what came out of his mouth. It was amazing.
I love this about radio.
That's right.
This isn't going
anywhere.
anywhere.
Happened.
This isn't going anywhere.
No. This is the sort of stuff that I aired in the Doug Copeland interview, though.
Yes, and I thought that was a little cheap, actually.
No, he deserved a little.
Well, I thought it was a bit cheap, though. Whenever someone puts ums and ahs and stuff in there,
it was more than ums and ahs. It was way more than that.
Yeah, well, obviously he ticked you off.
Oh, he was beyond words. He was self-centered and staggeringly obnoxious. Just. You know, and I'm sure you've got a guy coming in, you know, and you're being friendly, and you want to do this interview, and you're only going to go so far. When he asked me my name, and then wrote K-E-N in big letters on this piece of paper, and propped it up in the microphone in front of him so that he could remember my name during the interview. That's what tore it. And I would ask him a question,
pretentious little,
and he would sit there, and there'd be this silence that just went on and on and on. And then finally he'd go, well, I don't want to answer that one, or something like that, or he'd do, and then he'd give this half-baked answer, and then he'd stop and say, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I was up late last night," and but he wasn't really apologizing, and it was brutal. It was just brutal, and he wasn't even trying. Like, he was not even trying, and I guess he thought he was being postmodern or something. I don't know what he thought he was being. And he basically just, I'm not even sure whether he said to me or whether it was just an assumption on his part. I think he said something, but, well, you can cut all this out afterwards. No, he did say, we can cut all this out afterwards. And I thought, well, we'll see about that, won't we? And so I aired that interview exactly the way it happened. And I am vilified to this day on certain Doug Copeland fan websites. To this day, there are people out there who hate me because of that. Screw them, I say.
Thanks very much for your time, Ken.
You're welcome.
Ken Rockburn is an iconic Ottawa-based writer, broadcaster, interviewer.